The year 410 CE did not feel like the dramatic end of an empire when it happened. No great battle marked the moment. No final legion marched out in formation while trumpets echoed across the hills. Instead, it arrived quietly, almost like a letter forgotten on a table, when Emperor Honorius sent a rescript to the cities of Britain telling them something that would change everything, that they must now look to their own defenses. And with that single instruction, nearly 4 centuries of Roman rule dissolved into uncertainty. To understand how heavy that moment was, you have to imagine what Britain had been under Rome. Not a distant outpost barely holding on, but a structured, deeply integrated province of a vast empire that stretched from the deserts of Syria to the forests of Germany, a place of roads, cities, taxes, laws, and order, where Roman identity had blended with local traditions to form something entirely new, Romano-British society. And for generations, people had lived their entire lives believing Rome would always be there, always watching, always protecting. But by the early 5th century, that illusion was already cracking. The legions had not disappeared overnight. They had been pulled away piece by piece, like threads unraveling from a fabric, especially when Constantine III, a general proclaimed emperor by his troops in Britain around 407 CE, made a decision that would seal the island's fate. He stripped Britain of its remaining mobile field army and crossed into Gaul, chasing power on the continent, leaving behind a land that suddenly felt exposed. And what remained was not nothing, but it was not enough. There were still local troops, still fortified towns, still officials who tried to maintain order, but without the central authority of Rome. Everything began to weaken, slowly at first, then all at once like a structure whose foundations had already rotted long before it finally collapsed. The threats were not theoretical. From the north, the Picts pushed south, testing defenses that had once been unbreakable when Hadrian's Wall was fully manned. From the west came Irish raiders crossing the sea in swift boats, striking coastal settlements and vanishing before any response could be organized. And within Britain itself, unrest grew as economic systems faltered and confidence in leadership faded. The Roman administrative machine had been incredibly complex. Provincial governors overseeing regions, magistrates running cities, tax systems feeding resources into the empire, engineers maintaining roads and infrastructure. But all of this depended on imperial support, and when that support vanished, the system didn't adapt, it fragmented. Cities that had once been centers of power and administration began to lose their purpose. Places like Silchester and Wroxeter, which had thrived as hubs of Roman life, started to change in ways that archaeologists can still see today. Public buildings fell into disrepair, grand basilicas were no longer maintained, bathhouses that once echoed with conversation and steam went cold, their hypo-cost heating systems abandoned because no one had the knowledge or resources to repair them. You can almost picture it, a once bustling town slowly becoming quieter, rooms closing off, walls crumbling, weeds pushing through stone floors, as daily life shrank from public spaces into smaller, more defensible areas. Even the roads, those famous Roman roads that had connected the island with such efficiency, began to decay. Without centralized maintenance, potholes formed, bridges weakened, and routes that had once allowed rapid movement of troops and goods became unreliable, isolating communities that had once been tightly linked. And then came the economic collapse. Roman Britain had been part of a vast trade network, importing goods from across the empire, fine pottery, wine, oil, metalwork. But as connections with the continent weakened, those goods stopped arriving, local industries struggled to replace them, and the standard of living began to fall. Archaeological evidence shows a sharp decline in the production of high-quality pottery and metal goods, replaced by simpler, locally made items, and even these became less common over time. It wasn't just a political collapse, it was a transformation of everyday life. Into this vacuum stepped new figures, not appointed officials, not governors sent from Rome, but local strongmen, individuals who had the one thing that mattered now, the ability to command force. Some were former Roman officers. Others were members of the local aristocracy who adapted quickly to the new reality, and they began to carve out territories, controlling land, collecting tribute, and offering protection in exchange for loyalty. These were the first warlords of post-Roman Britain. They didn't rule cities in the Roman sense. Instead, they focused on defensible locations, hill forts, fortified settlements, places that could be held against attack. At sites like South Cadbury Castle, archaeologists have found evidence of this transformation. Ancient Iron Age hill forts that had long been abandoned were reoccupied and refortified, timber halls built within old earthworks, showing how quickly people adapted, turning to older forms of defense in a world where Roman order no longer existed. The countryside changed too. The villa system, which had supported rural Roman life, large estates producing food and goods, began to collapse. These estates were difficult to defend, too spread out, too dependent on stable conditions. And as insecurity grew, people abandoned them, moving instead to smaller, more defensible communities. What emerged was a patchwork of territories, each controlled by a local leader, each responsible for its own survival. And in this fractured landscape, a decision was made that would shape the future of Britain in ways no one at the time could have fully understood. Sometime around the middle of the 5th century, British leaders, facing constant raids and lacking reliable military forces, turned to outsiders for help. According to the 6th century writer Gildas, they invited Germanic mercenaries to come and fight on their behalf. These were not unknown people. They came from across the North Sea, from regions that are now Denmark and northern Germany, warriors with their own traditions, their own weapons, their own ways of life. At first, this was not an invasion. It was a contract. The idea was simple: hire these fighters, give them land or payment, and use them to defend against threats like the Picts. And for a time, it may have worked. But relationships built on necessity can quickly change when power shifts. More groups arrived. Settlements began to form. What had started as control migration slowly became something much larger. The Germanic peoples who came, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, did not just fight, they stayed. They brought families, established communities, and began to reshape the cultural landscape of Britain. Archaeology gives us one of the clearest windows into this transformation. At sites like Spong Hill, thousands of cremation burials have been uncovered. Over 2,400 urns, each containing the burned remains of individuals along with grave goods, objects that tell us about identity, belief, and origin. These burial practices were completely different from those of the Romano-British population. The urns themselves, decorated with geometric patterns, reflect traditions from the Germanic homelands, showing continuity of culture even as people moved across the sea. And it wasn't just burial customs. Everything began to change. Pottery styles shifted from wheel-thrown Roman designs to hand-built forms with different shapes and decorations. Weapons changed too. Long iron spears, single-edged blades known as seaxes, and distinctive shield designs replaced Roman military equipment. Even clothing styles can be traced through artifacts like brooches. In Anglian regions, cruciform brooches appear, while Saxon areas show saucer brooches, allowing archaeologists to map where different groups settled with remarkable precision. This was not just migration, it was transformation. But here's where the story becomes more complex than simple replacement. For a long time, people imagined that these newcomers pushed out or destroyed the existing Romano-British population, but modern evidence suggests something far more complicated. At cemeteries like West Saxon, scientific analysis of human remains has revealed that many individuals buried with Germanic-style grave goods were actually born locally. In other words, they were not immigrants. They were Britons who had adopted the culture of the newcomers. This suggests a process not of total conquest, but of blending, adaptation, and identity shift. People didn't just disappear. They changed. And in the west of Britain, in places like Tintagel Castle, something else was happening entirely. There, archaeological evidence shows continued occupation and long-distance trade. Imported pottery from North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean has been found, along with inscriptions that suggest Christian communities continued to exist, maintaining connections with a wider world even as Eastern Britain transformed. So while the East and South were becoming something new, Anglo-Saxon in language and culture, The West held on to older traditions, Roman, British, and Christian. It was not one story. It was many stories happening at the same time. And somewhere within this fractured, shifting world, where warlords ruled, cultures blended, and identities changed, the seeds of legend were planted. Because later generations would look back at this time of chaos and remember figures who resisted, leaders who fought back against the advancing Saxons, and from those memories would emerge one of the most enduring names in history. Arthur, not yet the king of legend, not yet the figure of myth and romance, but perhaps at the very beginning, a reflection of something real, a memory of resistance in a world that was falling apart and being rebuilt at the same time. And as the newcomers settled, as territories formed, as identities hardened, the stage was being set for the rise of entirely new kingdoms, kingdoms that would define the future of England. But that is where the next part begins. The year 410 CE did not feel like the dramatic end of an empire when it happened. No great battle marked the moment. No final legion marched out in formation while trumpets echoed across the hills. Instead, it arrived quietly, almost like a letter forgotten on a table, when Emperor Honorius sent a rescript to the cities of Britain telling them something that would change everything, that they must now look to their own defenses. And with that single instruction, nearly 4 centuries of Roman rule dissolved into uncertainty. To understand how heavy that moment was, you have to imagine what Britain had been under Rome. Not a distant outpost barely holding on, but a structured, deeply integrated province of a vast empire that stretched from the deserts of Syria to the forests of Germany, a place of roads, cities, taxes, laws, and order, where Roman identity had blended with local traditions to form something entirely new, Romano-British society. And for generations, people had lived their entire lives believing Rome would always be there, always watching, always protecting. But by the early 5th century, that illusion was already cracking. The legions had not disappeared overnight. They had been pulled away piece by piece, like threads unraveling from a fabric, especially when Constantine III, a general proclaimed emperor by his troops in Britain around 407 CE, made a decision that would seal the island's fate. He stripped Britain of its remaining mobile field army and crossed into Gaul, chasing power on the continent, leaving behind a land that suddenly felt exposed. And what remained was not nothing, but it was not enough. There were still local troops, still fortified towns, still officials who tried to maintain order, but without the central authority of Rome. Everything began to weaken, slowly at first, then all at once like a structure whose foundations had already rotted long before it finally collapsed. The threats were not theoretical. From the north, the Picts pushed south, testing defenses that had once been unbreakable when Hadrian's wall was fully manned. From the west came Irish raiders crossing the sea in swift boats, striking coastal settlements and vanishing before any response could be organized. And within Britain itself, unrest grew as economic systems faltered and confidence in leadership faded. The Roman administrative machine had been incredibly complex, provincial governors overseeing regions, magistrates running cities, tax systems feeding resources into the empire, engineers maintaining roads and infrastructure. But all of this depended on imperial support, and when that support vanished, the system didn't adapt, it fragmented. Cities that had once been centers of power and administration began to lose their purpose. Places like Silchester and Wroxeter, which had thrived as hubs of Roman life, started to change in ways that archaeologists can still see today. Public buildings fell into disrepair, grand basilicas were no longer maintained, bathhouses that once echoed with conversation and steam went cold, their hypo-cost heating systems abandoned because no one had the knowledge or resources to repair them. You can almost picture it. A once bustling town slowly becoming quieter, rooms closing off, walls crumbling, weeds pushing through stone floors, as daily life shrank from public spaces into smaller, more defensible areas. Even the roads, those famous Roman roads that had connected the island with such efficiency, began to decay. Without centralized maintenance, potholes formed, bridges weakened, and routes that had once allowed rapid movement of troops and goods became unreliable, isolating communities that had once been tightly linked. And then came the economic collapse. Roman Britain had been part of a vast trade network, importing goods from across the empire, fine pottery, wine, oil, metalwork. But as connections with the continent weakened, those goods stopped arriving, local industries struggled to replace them, and the standard of living began to fall. Archaeological evidence shows a sharp decline in the production of high-quality pottery and metal goods, replaced by simpler, locally made items, and even these became less common over time. It wasn't just a political collapse, it was a transformation of everyday life. Into this vacuum stepped new figures, not appointed officials, not governors sent from Rome, but local strongmen, individuals who had the one thing that mattered now, the ability to command force. Some were former Roman officers. Others were members of the local aristocracy who adapted quickly to the new reality, and they began to carve out territories, controlling land, collecting tribute, and offering protection in exchange for loyalty. These were the first warlords of post-Roman Britain. They didn't rule cities in the Roman sense. Instead, they focused on defensible locations, hill forts, fortified settlements, places that could be held against attack. At sites like South Cadbury Castle, archaeologists have found evidence of this transformation. Ancient Iron Age hill forts that had long been abandoned were reoccupied and refortified, timber halls built within old earthworks, showing how quickly people adapted, turning to older forms of defense in a world where Roman order no longer existed. The countryside changed too. The villa system, which had supported rural Roman life, large estates producing food and goods, began to collapse. These estates were difficult to defend, too spread out, too dependent on stable conditions. And as insecurity grew, people abandoned them, moving instead to smaller, more defensible communities. What emerged was a patchwork of territories, each controlled by a local leader, each responsible for its own survival. And in this fractured landscape, a decision was made that would shape the future of Britain in ways no one at the time could have fully understood. Sometime around the middle of the 5th century, British leaders, facing constant raids and lacking reliable military forces, turned to outsiders for help. According to the 6th century writer Gildas, they invited Germanic mercenaries to come and fight on their behalf. These were not unknown people. They came from across the North Sea, from regions that are now Denmark and northern Germany, warriors with their own traditions, their own weapons, their own ways of life. At first, this was not an invasion. It was a contract. The idea was simple. Hire these fighters, give them land or payment, and use them to defend against threats like the Picts. And for a time, it may have worked. But relationships built on necessity can quickly change when power shifts. More groups arrived. Settlements began to form. What had started as controlled migration slowly became something much larger. The Germanic peoples who came, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, did not just fight, they stayed. They brought families, established communities, and began to reshape the cultural landscape of Britain. Archaeology gives us one of the clearest windows into this transformation. At sites like Spong Hill, thousands of cremation burials have been uncovered. Over 2,400 urns, each containing the burned remains of individuals along with grave goods, objects that tell us about identity, belief, and origin. These burial practices were completely different from those of the Romano-British population. The urns themselves, decorated with geometric patterns, reflect traditions from the Germanic homelands, showing continuity of culture even as people moved across the sea. And it wasn't just burial customs. Everything began to change. Pottery styles shifted from wheel-thrown Roman designs to hand-built forms with different shapes and decorations. Weapons changed too. Long iron spears, single-edged blades known as seaxes, and distinctive shield designs replaced Roman military equipment. Even clothing styles can be traced through artifacts like brooches. In Anglian regions, cruciform brooches appear, while Saxon areas show saucer brooches, allowing archaeologists to map where different groups settled with remarkable precision. This was not just migration, it was transformation. But here's where the story becomes more complex than simple replacement. For a long time, people imagined that these newcomers pushed out or destroyed the existing Romano-British population. But modern evidence suggests something far more complicated. At cemeteries like West Saxon, scientific analysis of human remains has revealed that many individuals buried with Germanic-style grave goods were actually born locally. In other words, they were not immigrants. They were Britons who had adopted the culture of the newcomers. This suggests a process not of total conquest, but of blending, adaptation, and identity shift. People didn't just disappear. They changed. And in the west of Britain, in places like Tintagel Castle, something else was happening entirely. There, archaeological evidence shows continued occupation and long-distance trade. Imported pottery from North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean has been found, along with inscriptions that suggest Christian communities continued to exist, maintaining connections with a wider world even as Eastern Britain transformed. So while the East and South were becoming something new, Anglo-Saxon in language and culture, the West held on to older traditions, Roman, British, and Christian. It was not one story. It was many stories happening at the same time. And somewhere within this fractured, shifting world, where warlords ruled, cultures blended, and identities changed, the seeds of legend were planted. Because later generations would look back at this time of chaos and remember figures who resisted, leaders who fought back against the advancing Saxons, and from those memories would emerge one of the most enduring names in history. Arthur, not yet the king of legend, not yet the figure of myth and romance, but perhaps at the very beginning, a reflection of something real, a memory of resistance in a world that was falling apart and being rebuilt at the same time. And as the newcomers settled, as territories formed, as identities hardened, the stage was being set for the rise of entirely new kingdoms, kingdoms that would define the future of England. But that is where the next part begins. As the decades passed after the first Germanic settlers arrived, the landscape of Britain did not suddenly become stable. It remained unpredictable, tense, and constantly shifting. But something important began to take shape out of that instability. Something more permanent than war bands and temporary strongholds. Something that would define the island for centuries, the slow and uneven birth of kingdoms. These were not kingdoms in the sense of Rome, with fixed borders and centralized bureaucracies, but they were far more structured than the fragmented rule of local warlords. They were evolving systems of power built around loyalty, land, and warfare. And at their core stood kings who were expected not just to rule, but to lead, to fight, and to reward. The Germanic settlers did not arrive as a single unified people. They came in groups, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, each with their own traditions and identities, and as they spread across eastern and southern Britain, their settlements began to cluster into regions that would later be recognized as distinct political entities. In the south, along the fertile lands of the Thames Valley and beyond, Saxon groups established themselves, forming the early foundations of what would become Wessex, Essex, and Sussex, their names literally meaning West Saxons, East Saxons, and South Saxons, simple descriptions that reflected both geography and identity. 7. These were not vast empires at first, but clusters of settlements connected by kinship and allegiance, where a leader's power depended on his ability to attract and maintain followers, warriors who fought for him in exchange for land, treasure, and status. Further north and east, the Angles spread into different regions, giving rise to larger and eventually more powerful kingdoms like Mercia, Northumbria, and East Anglia. And it was from their name, the Angles, that the very word England would eventually emerge. The Jutes, fewer in number, but no less significant, settled primarily in Kent and the Isle of Wight, and Kent in particular would develop in a way that set it apart from the others. But at this stage, these regions were not stable kingdoms with clear borders. They were fluid, expanding, contracting, sometimes merging, sometimes breaking apart, shaped by constant warfare. Because war was not an occasional event. It was the foundation of power. A king's authority came from victory, from his ability to protect his people and to take land from his enemies. And failure in battle could mean not just defeat, but the complete collapse of his rule. The structure of these societies revolved around what historians call the comitatus, the war band, a group of loyal warriors bound personally to their leader, not by abstract law, but by honor, loyalty, and reward. These warriors expected their king to provide them with wealth, weapons, and feasts, and in return they fought for him, often to the death. Archaeological evidence from sites like Yevering reveals large timber halls that served as the centers of the system, not just residences, but places of gathering, where feasting reinforced loyalty, where decisions were made, and where power was displayed. Inside these halls, relationships were built and maintained through rituals that were as important as battle itself. The giving of gifts, rings, weapons, and treasure, symbols of a king's generosity and strength. And outside these halls, the land itself was changing. Settlements expanded, forests were cleared, new farming systems developed, and over time, these communities became more stable, more rooted. But stability did not mean peace. Because alongside the rise of Anglo-Saxon power, there remained another force in Britain, the surviving Romano-British kingdoms in the West. These were not remnants fading quietly into history. They were active, organized, and often resistant, occupying regions like Wales, Cornwall, and parts of the north, and they fought to hold their ground against the expanding Anglo-Saxon territories. For a time, they were successful. One of the most important moments in this struggle is remembered in the writings of Gildas, who describes a major British victory at the Battle of Mons Badonicus, often dated to around 500 CE. This battle appears to have halted Anglo-Saxon expansion for a generation. It was significant enough that its memory endured, eventually becoming associated with the legendary figure of King Arthur, though the historical reality behind that legend remains uncertain. What matters is that this period was not a simple conquest. It was a long, contested struggle, with shifting front lines and periods of both advance and retreat. But over time, the balance began to shift. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms grew stronger, more organized, more capable of sustained expansion, while many of the British kingdoms became increasingly isolated. And as this happened, something else began to develop, something that would turn these scattered kingdoms into something more recognizable as states. Administration. At first, kings ruled through personal relationships, but as territories expanded, that was no longer enough. They needed systems to manage land, to resolve disputes, to collect resources. And so early forms of governance began to appear. In Kent, for example, which benefited from its proximity to the continent, trade flourished. Goods moved across the channel, connecting the kingdom to the Frankish world, and this contact brought not just wealth but ideas. Archaeological finds from sites like Fingalsham show rich burials filled with imported goods, evidence of a society that was becoming more complex and more connected. Kent's rulers began to develop law codes, structured systems of compensation for crimes, known as wergild, where every person had a value based on their social status. This was not abstract justice. It was practical, a way to prevent endless cycles of revenge by establishing clear rules for resolving conflict. Elsewhere, in the Midlands, Mercia grew in power due to its central position. It controlled important land routes, linking different parts of the island, and this gave its rulers strategic advantages. In the north, Northumbria became one of the most significant kingdoms, stretching from the Humber River to what is now southern Scotland, formed from the union of two earlier regions, Bernish-Nisha and Dara. At sites like Bamborough Castle, evidence of strong fortifications shows how important defense remained, even as kingdoms grew. 5. But even as these kingdoms developed, they were still deeply shaped by their origins. Their cultures remained rooted in Germanic traditions, their beliefs centered on pagan gods, their social structures based on warrior elites. And yet, just beyond their shores, and even within parts of Britain itself, another force was waiting, one that would change not just politics, but identity, belief, and the very way people understood the world. Christianity. It had never completely disappeared from Britain. In the western regions, it had survived through the collapse of Roman rule, maintained by communities that still looked to the wider Christian world. But in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, it had not yet taken hold. That would change at the end of the 6th century, in a moment that would reshape the future of England. In 597 CE, a mission arrived in Kent, sent by Pope Gregory the Great, led by a monk named Augustine of Canterbury. They came not as conquerors, but as missionaries, carrying with them a new religion, a new worldview, and a connection to a vast spiritual network that stretched across Europe. Their arrival was not random. Kent was chosen carefully. Its king, Ethelbert of Kent, had already established ties with the Frankish kingdoms through his marriage to a Christian princess, Bertha, and this connection created an opening. According to later accounts, when Augustine met Ethelbert, the king insisted the meeting take place outdoors, wary of any possible magic or trickery, a small detail that reveals just how unfamiliar and uncertain this encounter was. But the mission succeeded. Not immediately, not completely, but steadily. Ethelbert converted to Christianity, and with him, the first Anglo-Saxon kingdom began to change. Churches were built, clergy were established, and slowly, the new religion began to spread. But this was not a simple replacement of old beliefs. It was a process of blending, adaptation, and negotiation. Pagan traditions did not vanish overnight. They were absorbed, reshaped, given new meanings within a Christian framework. And as Christianity spread, it brought with it something else. Literacy, connection to the wider European world, new forms of law and governance. It began to transform these warrior kingdoms into something more structured, more unified. But this transformation was not smooth. It would face resistance. It would create conflict. And in some places, it would collapse before rising again. Because the story of Britain was still far from stable. The kingdoms were growing, but so were their ambitions. Rivalries were intensifying, and as power concentrated, the stage was being set for larger conflicts that would decide which kingdoms would dominate and which would fall. And at the same time, beyond the horizon, across the cold waters of the North Sea, new forces were beginning to stir, forces that would one day strike without warning and change everything again. But before that storm arrives, the story must follow how these kingdoms reach their height, how they built power, wealth, and culture strong enough to stand or to be broken. As the new faith began to take root in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, it did not sweep across the land like a sudden storm. It moved slowly, unevenly, shaped by politics as much as belief, by alliances as much as conviction. And in many ways, the story of Christianity in early England is not just about religion, but about power, identity, and the reshaping of society itself. The conversion of Ethelbert of Kent was only the beginning, a spark rather than transformation, because while a king's decision carried enormous influence, it did not instantly change the beliefs of an entire population, especially in a world where traditions were deeply rooted and where loyalty often followed local leaders more than distant authority. In Kent, Christianity gained a firm foothold. Churches were established, clergy organized, and connections with the continent strengthened. But beyond Kent, the situation was far more uncertain. In places like Essex, the initial conversion of kings did not guarantee lasting change. When King Saber died, his successors rejected Christianity and expelled the missionaries, returning to older beliefs, and this pattern would repeat across different regions. Conversion followed by reversal, faith rising and falling with the fortunes of rulers. This instability reveals something crucial about the period. Religion was not yet a deeply personal identity for most people. It was tied to leadership, to authority, to the structures of power, and when those structures shifted, so too did belief. But in the North, a different story was unfolding, one that would have a lasting impact on the intellectual and cultural development of England. The Kingdom of Northumbria, already one of the most powerful in Britain, became the stage for a dramatic and complex process of conversion that involved not one, but two different traditions of Christianity. When King Edwin of Northumbria came to power, he was still a pagan ruler, but his marriage to a Christian princess from Kent brought new influences into his court, including the missionary bishop Paulinus, who began preaching the new faith. Edwin's eventual decision to convert, traditionally dated to 627 CE, was not made lightly, and the account preserved by Bede gives us a rare glimpse into the mindset of the time. According to this account, Edwin gathered his advisors to discuss the new religion, and what followed was not blind acceptance, but debate, careful consideration of what Christianity offered compared to traditional beliefs. One noble famously described human life as like a sparrow flying through a great hall in winter, entering from the darkness outside, passing briefly through warmth and light, and then disappearing again into the darkness. A powerful image of uncertainty, of the unknown nature of existence. And it was precisely this uncertainty that Christianity seemed to address. For Edwin, conversion was both a spiritual and political act. By embracing Christianity, he aligned himself with powerful kingdoms in Europe, gained access to literate clergy who could assist in administration, and strengthened his position as a ruler connected to a broader world. But again, conversion at the top did not mean immediate transformation below. Churches had to be built, priests trained, communities persuaded. And in Northumbria, this process took a dramatic turn after Edwin's death. In 633 CE, Edwin was defeated and killed at the Battle of Hatfield Chase, and his death triggered a collapse of the fragile Christian structure that had been established. Pagan rulers returned to power, and for a brief but significant period, Christianity seemed to retreat. But it did not disappear. Instead, it returned in a different form. When King Oswald of Northumbria regained control, he did not turn to kin for missionaries. Instead, he looked to the Irish monastic tradition, specifically to the monastery of Iona Abbey, founded by Columba. This decision introduced a second form of Christianity into England, one that differed in important ways from the Roman tradition brought by Augustine. From Iona came Aidan of Lindisfarne, who established a monastery on the island of Lindisfarne around 635 CE. Aidan's approach was different. Where earlier missionaries had sometimes focused on royal courts, Aidan traveled, spoke directly to people, learned their language, and emphasized personal teaching and example. This method proved highly effective. Christianity spread more deeply, more widely, becoming part of everyday life rather than just royal policy. Lindisfarne quickly became a major center of religious and cultural activity, a place where monks lived, prayed, studied, and produced manuscripts, and from this remote island, influence spread across Northumbria and beyond. But this success brought with it a new problem. England now had two Christian traditions, the Roman and the Irish, and they did not always agree. The differences might seem small at first glance, how to calculate the date of Easter, how monks should wear their hair, but these details carried deeper implications about authority, about connection to Rome versus independence of local traditions. This tension came to a head in 664 CE at the Synod of Whitby, convened by King Oswiu of Northumbria. There, representatives of both traditions debated their practices, and the decision ultimately favored the Roman system. It was a turning point, not because it ended Irish influence completely, but because it aligned the English Church more closely with continental Europe and the authority of Rome. From that point on, Christianity in England became more unified, more structured, more connected to a wider network. And with that unity came growth. Monasteries expanded, learning flourished, and England, particularly Northumbria, entered a period that would later be seen as a golden age of culture and scholarship. At places like Monkwearmouth Jarrow Abbey, founded by Benedict Biscop, a remarkable intellectual environment developed. Biscop traveled multiple times to Rome, bringing back books, relics, and knowledge, building one of the most impressive libraries in Northern Europe. It was here that Bede lived and worked, producing writings that would shape our understanding of this entire period. His work, The Ecclesiastical History of the English People, was not just a record of events. It was a carefully constructed narrative, drawing on multiple sources, organizing history in a way that connected past and present, and for the first time, presenting the idea of a single English people united not just by land but by faith. This was a powerful idea, because until this point, the various kingdoms, Kent, Mercia, Northumbria, Wessex, had been separate, often rivals, sometimes enemies. But Christianity, literacy, and shared cultural practices began to create connections between them. Not political unity yet, but something that made unity possible in the future. And while Northumbria flourished culturally, another kingdom was rising in power. In the Midlands, Mercia began to assert dominance. Under rulers like Penda of Mercia, Mercia expanded aggressively, defeating rivals, controlling territory, and becoming the most powerful kingdom in England during the mid-7th century. What makes Penda particularly interesting is that he remained a pagan ruler, even as Christianity spread around him. Yet he was not simply opposed to the new religion. He allowed Christian missionaries to operate within his lands and did not force his subjects to reject the faith. This suggests a level of pragmatism. For Penda, power mattered more than belief. And under his leadership, Mercia became a dominant military force. His death in 655 CE at the Battle of the Windwade marked a turning point, not just for Mercia, but for the spread of Christianity. After his death, Mercia gradually converted, and the last major pagan stronghold among the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms disappeared. From that point on, Christianity was no longer one option among many. It became the dominant framework for society. But as belief spread, so too did political ambition. Kings did not stop competing. If anything, their rivalries intensified, because now, power was not just about land and warriors, it was also about legitimacy, about being recognized as a rightful ruler in a Christian world. And this led to the rise of even more powerful kings, rulers who sought not just to dominate their neighbors, but to claim authority over all of England. Among them was Offa of Mercia, whose reign in the late 8th century marked the height of Mercian power. Offa was not just a warrior king. He was an administrator, a diplomat, and a ruler who understood the importance of projecting authority. His influence extended across much of southern England, and he even corresponded with Charlemagne, one of the most powerful rulers in Europe at the time. This was a different level of kingship, not just local dominance, but international recognition. And one of the most visible symbols of Offa's power still exists today. Offa's Dyke, a massive earthwork stretching across the border between England and Wales, it was not simply a defensive structure, but a statement. A line drawn across the land, marking territory, control, and authority. Its construction required enormous resources and coordination, showing just how far Anglo-Saxon society had come from the fragmented world of the early 5th century. But even as kingdoms reached new heights of power, wealth, and organization, even as monasteries produced beautiful manuscripts and scholars wrote histories, even as kings built structures that reshaped the landscape, there was something they did not yet fully understand. They were not alone. Beyond the seas, in the cold northern regions, other societies were changing, growing, and watching. And soon, without warning, they would arrive. Not as settlers invited to help, not as allies, but as raiders. And the first strike would come in a place that symbolized everything the Anglo-Saxon world had built. A monastery, a center of faith, learning, and wealth. A place called Lindisfarne. And when that moment comes, it will feel like the world is breaking again. By the late 8th century, Anglo-Saxon England had reached a level of stability and prosperity that would have been unimaginable in the chaotic years after Rome's withdrawal. Kingdoms were established, trade networks stretched across the sea. Monasteries had become centers of wealth, learning, and faith. And for many, it may have felt as though the worst was long behind them, as though the island had finally found its balance again. But history rarely moves in straight lines. And sometimes, the very success of a society becomes the reason it is targeted. On June 8th, 793 CE, something happened that would echo through history with a force far greater than the event itself, something that would later be remembered not just as an attack, but as the beginning of an age of fear. The target was Lindisfarne. To understand why this mattered so much, you have to understand what Lindisfarne was. It was not just a monastery. It was a symbol, a place of deep spiritual importance, a center of learning, a connection between heaven and earth in the minds of those who lived there, a place where monks had copied sacred texts, where prayers had been offered day and night, where the legacy of figures like Aidan of Lindisfarne still lingered. And it was vulnerable. Monasteries were often built in isolated locations, close to the sea but far from fortified towns, chosen for their quiet and separation from the world, not for defense. They held wealth, gold and silver vessels, decorated manuscripts, offerings given over generations, but they had little in the way of protection. And on that day, ships appeared on the horizon. Long, narrow vessels cutting through the water with speed and precision, carrying men who were unlike any the Anglo-Saxons had faced before. These were Vikings. They did not come with banners or declarations. They came fast. They came with purpose. And they came with knowledge. Because this was not a random strike. The attackers knew where they were going. They knew Lindisfarne was rich. They knew it was undefended. And when they landed, they moved with terrifying efficiency. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle records strange signs appearing before the attack. Lightning, fiery dragons in the sky, visions that terrified those who saw them. And while these descriptions may seem symbolic, they reflect something very real: the shock, the confusion, the sense that something unnatural had happened. Because no one expected this. The monks were not soldiers. They were not prepared for violence. And the attack was brutal. Buildings were broken into. Treasures were seized. Sacred objects were stripped of their gold and silver. Those who resisted were killed. Others were taken. Because the Vikings did not just come to steal. They came to capture. Slavery was a central part of their economy. And monks, educated, valuable, and defenseless, were perfect targets. Some were dragged onto ships and taken across the sea, never to return. Others were left behind in destruction. The monastery itself was devastated, and the psychological impact was immediate and profound. This was not just an attack on a place. It was an attack on an idea. The idea that holy places were protected. The idea that God would defend those who served him. For many, this event raised terrifying questions. If Lindisfarne could fall, what was safe? Alcuin of York, writing from the court of Charlemagne, expressed horror at what had happened, describing it as something unprecedented, a punishment, perhaps, or a warning. And in that reaction, you can see how deeply the attack shook the Christian world. But for the Vikings, this was only the beginning. The success of Lindisfarne showed what was possible. It revealed weaknesses. It opened a path. And in the years that followed, more attacks came. In 794, the monastery at Jarrow was targeted, though this time the defenders were more prepared and the raiders faced resistance. Still, the pattern was established. Coastal monasteries, isolated and wealthy, became prime targets. Ireland, Scotland, and England all began to feel the pressure. At first, these raids were seasonal. Small groups arriving, striking quickly, and leaving. But even these early attacks had a cumulative effect. Monasteries began to fortify themselves. Precious objects were hidden or moved inland. Communities became more cautious. And yet, the attacks continued. Because the Vikings were not just raiders. They were traders, explorers, and they were connected to a vast network that stretched across northern Europe. Silver taken from England could be traded in Scandinavia, moved eastward through river systems into the Byzantine Empire or the Islamic world, and in return, goods, weapons, and wealth flowed back. The raids were part of something larger, an expanding system of movement, exchange, and opportunity. And over time, something began to change. The raids became more organized, larger, more sustained. What had been quick strikes started to turn into longer campaigns. Because the Vikings were learning. They were learning the geography of the land, the political divisions between kingdoms, the weaknesses in defense, and perhaps most importantly, they were learning that they could stay. By the early 9th century, the balance of power in England was shifting again. The kingdom of Mercia, once dominant under rulers like Offa, began to weaken after his death. Without a strong central authority, its influence declined, and the unity it had once imposed over other kingdoms faded. This fragmentation made coordinated defense against Viking attacks extremely difficult. Each kingdom acted on its own. Each faced threats independently, and the Vikings took advantage of this. Raids increased in frequency and scale. Coastal areas were hit repeatedly. Rivers became highways for attackers, allowing them to penetrate deep into the interior. Settlements that had once felt secure now found themselves exposed. And then, in 865 CE, everything changed. Because this time, the Vikings did not come as a raiding party. They came as an army. It was known as the Great Heathen Army, and it was unlike anything England had faced before. Led by figures such as Ivar the Boneless and Halfdan Ragnarsson, this was not a force that intended to strike and leave. It intended to conquer. They landed in East Anglia, but instead of immediately attacking, they secured horses, preparing for movement inland. This alone shows their level of planning. They were not improvising. They had a strategy. From there, they moved north and captured the city of York in 866, one of the most important urban centers in England, turning it into a Viking stronghold. The fall of York was a major blow. It was not just a city. It was a political and economic hub. Its capture signaled that no place, no matter how significant, was beyond reach. Archaeological evidence from York shows how quickly the city adapted under Viking control, transforming into a center of trade and craft production, connecting England to a wider Scandinavian world. The army did not stop. It moved through kingdoms, exploiting divisions, defeating rulers, and establishing control. Some kingdoms fell quickly. Others resisted, but one by one the balance shifted. And in the face of this overwhelming force, the Anglo-Saxon world faced one of its greatest crises. Because this was no longer about isolated attacks. This was about survival. And as kingdoms collapsed and territories were taken, only one major power remained capable of mounting serious resistance: Wessex. And within Wessex, a king would rise whose actions would not only stop the Viking advance, but reshape the future of England itself. But the moment when that story begins, things look far from certain. Because the Vikings are winning, the old order is breaking again. And it will take everything, strategy, resilience, and something entirely new to change the outcome. By the time the Great Heathen Army had carved its way through much of England, defeating kings, capturing cities, and establishing control over Vastus, it must have seemed to many that the end of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was not just possible, but inevitable. One after another had fallen or been reduced to submission, and what remained was no longer a collection of equal rivals, but a landscape dominated by Viking power. Northumbria had already been broken, its leadership fractured, its capital at York firmly under Scandinavian control, transformed into a center of Viking rule, where new systems of trade and governance began to take shape, blending elements of both cultures. Mercia, once the dominant force of the island, had been reduced, its independence weakened, its rulers forced into uneasy arrangements, part resistance, part submission, unable to fully challenge the growing power of the invaders. East Anglia had suffered one of the most decisive defeats, its king killed, its territory absorbed, becoming a base of operations for the Viking army. And so the pressure shifted south, toward the last major kingdom still standing, Wessex. Here, resistance did not collapse immediately, but it was tested again and again. In 871 CE, a young king came to power under the worst possible circumstances: Alfred the Great. He did not inherit stability. He inherited crisis. In his very first year as king, he faced repeated battles against Viking forces, some victories, some defeats, none decisive enough to end the threat. Places like Reading and Wilton saw fighting that drained resources and morale, showing just how close the balance was between survival and collapse. For a time, Alfred managed to hold the line, negotiating truces when necessary, fighting when possible, maintaining a fragile resistance. But the Vikings were not done. They adapted. They regrouped. And in 878 CE, they struck with a level of precision and timing that nearly ended everything. During winter, when warfare usually slowed, when armies dispersed and kings expected at least a brief pause, the Viking leader Guthrum launched a surprise attack. It was sudden, unexpected, devastating. Alfred's forces were caught off guard. Wessex was overrun. and the king himself was forced to flee. This moment is one of the most critical turning points in English history, because for a brief time, it seemed that even Wessex would fall, that the last organized resistance would disappear, and that the Viking conquest of England would be complete. Alfred did not retreat to a fortress. He disappeared into the marshlands of Somerset, to a place known as Athelney. This was not a position of strength. It was a place of survival. Surrounded by wetlands, difficult to access, hidden, it provided protection, but not power. From here, Alfred had to do something incredibly difficult. He had to rebuild, not just an army, but hope, because a king without land, without visible authority, could easily lose the loyalty of his people. And yet he did not. Support remained. Local populations, those who had suffered under Viking control or feared what would come next, continued to back him. Slowly, quietly, he gathered forces. This was not a grand mobilization. It was a careful, deliberate process. And when the time came, he moved. In the spring of 878, Alfred emerged from hiding and called his forces together. This moment was critical. If they failed to rally, if support had collapsed, there would be no second chance. But they came. From different parts of Wessex, men gathered, forming an army that, while not overwhelming, was strong enough to fight. And then came the confrontation, the Battle of Edington. This was not just another clash. This was decisive. Alfred's forces met Guthrum's army and, after sustained fighting, achieved a victory that changed everything. The Vikings were defeated, not destroyed, but broken enough to be forced into negotiation. And what followed was something new. Not just another temporary truce, but an agreement that would shape the future of England. Guthrum agreed to withdraw from Wessex and accept baptism into Christianity, becoming, at least formally, part of the same religious world as his former enemy. This was not just symbolic. It was political. It created a framework for coexistence. And it led to the division of England into two distinct zones, one under Anglo-Saxon control, one under Viking rule. This boundary, often associated with what later became known as the Danelaw, marked a new phase in the story. Because the Vikings were no longer just raiders or invaders. They were settlers, rulers, part of the landscape. But what makes Alfred truly significant is not just that he survived, or even that he won. It is what he did next. Because he understood something that previous kings had not fully grasped. That survival required change. But the old systems were not enough. And so he began to transform Wessex. One of his most important innovations was the creation of a network of fortified towns, known as Buzz. These are not random defenses. They were planned, strategically placed, designed to ensure that no part of the kingdom was too far from protection. If a Viking force arrived, local populations could retreat to these fortified centers, which were strong enough to withstand attack until a larger army could respond. Places like Wallingford and Cricklade show the scale of this effort, with earthworks, walls, and organized layouts that reflect careful planning. This system changed the nature of warfare. Instead of reacting to attacks, Wessex could now resist them, control them, limit their impact. But Alfred did not stop there. He reformed the military system itself. Rather than relying solely on temporary levies, he organized forces in a way that ensured continuous readiness, allowing some men to serve while others remained to work the land, maintaining both defense and food production. He also focused on the navy, recognizing that control of rivers and coastlines was essential in countering Viking mobility. These are not small changes. They were structural, and they worked. But perhaps the most remarkable part of Alfred's reign was not military. It was cultural, because he understood that survival was not just about fighting. It was about identity, about knowledge, about the ability to govern. At a time when learning had declined, when few could read Latin, when monasteries had been destroyed or weakened, Alfred initiated a program of education and translation. He brought scholars to his court. He promoted learning. And he oversaw the translation of important texts into Old English, making knowledge accessible in a way it had not been before. This was revolutionary. It meant that administration, law, and culture could function independently of a narrow elite trained in Latin. It created a more connected society, a more informed one. And alongside this, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle began to take shape, recording events, preserving memory, creating a sense of shared history. This was not just documentation. It was identity building. It told a story of continuity, of struggle, of purpose, and it placed Wessex at the center of that story. By the end of Alfred's reign, the situation had changed dramatically. The Vikings still controlled large parts of England, but they had been contained, and Wessex had been transformed into something stronger, more resilient, more capable than before. The balance of power had shifted, not completely, but enough, because Alfred had done something crucial. He had turned survival into a foundation. And from that foundation, the next phase would begin. Not just defense, but reconquest, because his successors would take what he built and push forward, reclaiming lost territories, expanding control, and moving towards something that had not existed before. A single, unified England. But that future was not guaranteed. It would have to be fought for, step by step, battle by battle. And the story of that struggle is what comes next. When Alfred the Great died in 899 CE, he did not leave behind a peaceful kingdom. He left behind a system, a structure strong enough to survive him, but still surrounded by enemies, still facing the constant presence of Scandinavian power across much of England. And the most important question at that moment was not what Alfred had achieved, but whether what he built could last without him. Because history is full of rulers who change everything during their lifetime, only for their work to collapse the moment they are gone. But that is not what happened here. Instead, something far more significant began. Continuation, expansion, and eventually unification. His son, Edward the Elder, inherited not just a throne, but a mission, and unlike many successors in history, he did not try to radically change his father's system. He strengthened it, expanded it, and used it as the foundation for something larger. At the same time, another key figure emerged, someone whose role is often underestimated but was absolutely critical in this transformation: his sister, Ethelflaed. She ruled in Mercia, not as a queen in the traditional sense, but as a leader in her own right, commanding armies, building fortifications, and coordinating campaigns. And the cooperation between Edward and Ethelflaed created a level of strategic unity that had rarely been seen before in Anglo-Saxon England. This was no longer just about defending Wessex. This was about reclaiming England. The territories under Viking control, often referred to as the Danelaw, were not empty lands waiting to be taken. They were established regions with their own systems, their own settlements, their own leaders, and any attempt to take them back would require not just military strength, but planning, coordination, and persistence. Edward and Ethelflaed did not rush. They advanced methodically. One of the most important tools they used was the same system Alfred had developed, the buzz. But now, instead of just defending territory, they used them offensively. As they moved into contested regions, they built new fortified towns, securing each area step by step, creating a network that prevented Viking forces from easily regrouping or launching counterattacks. This was not dramatic conquest. It was systematic pressure. Places like Hertford and Witham became part of this expanding network, each one a statement of control, each one reducing the space in which Viking forces could operate freely. And as this network expanded, something important happened. Local populations began to shift their loyalty. Because for many people living in the Danelaw, identity was not strictly divided between Anglo-Saxon and Viking. Over generations, communities had blended, cultures had mixed, and what mattered most was stability, security, and predictable rule. If Edward and Ethelflaed could provide that, then support would follow. And in many cases, it did. Some territories were taken by force. Others submitted. The process was not uniform, but it was effective. By the early 10th century, large parts of the Danelaw had been brought back under Anglo-Saxon control. Ethelflaed played a particularly important role in this. Her campaigns in Mercia were decisive, capturing key locations like Derby and Leicester, weakening Viking power in the Midlands and paving the way for further expansion. She was not just supporting Edward. She was shaping the outcome. And when she died in 918 CE, it marked the end of a unique moment, but not the end of the process. Because by then, the direction was clear. The reconquest would continue. Edward pressed forward, consolidating gains, extending control, and by the time of his death in 924 CE, the map of England had changed dramatically. But the final step, the moment when England would truly become a single kingdom under one ruler, came with his successor, Athelstan. Athelstan is often described as the first true king of England, not just because of the territories he controlled, but because of what that control represented. He did not inherit a divided land. He inherited momentum, and he used it. One of his most important achievements was the capture of York in 927 CE. York had been a major Viking center, a symbol of Scandinavian power in England, and its conquest was not just another victory. It was the final piece of the puzzle. With York under his control, Athelstan became the ruler of all the major Anglo-Saxon and former Viking territories. For the first time, there was a single king ruling what could truly be called England. But this did not mean that resistance disappeared. Far from it, because beyond England's borders, other powers watched closely. In the north and west, kingdoms in Scotland, Strathclyde, and among Norse settlers saw Ethelstan's rise as a threat, and alliances formed to challenge him. This led to one of the most important battles in early English history, the Battle of Brunanburh in 937 CE. This was not a small conflict. It was a coalition, Scottish forces, Norse Gaelic warriors, and others united against Athelstan, attempting to break the newly formed English kingdom before it could fully stabilize. The battle was intense, fierce, decisive, and Athelstan won. The victory at Brunanburh secured his position and confirmed the existence of a unified England as a major power. It was remembered for generations, celebrated in poetry, recorded as a moment of triumph that defined a people. But even with this victory, unification did not mean simplicity, because the kingdom Athelstan ruled was not culturally uniform. In the north and east, Scandinavian influence remained strong. Place names, customs, language, all reflected the legacy of Viking settlement. In the south and west, older Anglo-Saxon traditions dominated. And the challenge for rulers now was not just to conquer, but to govern, to integrate, to create systems that could hold together a diverse population. This required administration, law, structure, and Anglo-Saxon kings developed increasingly sophisticated systems to manage this. Law codes expanded, building on earlier traditions, but adapting to new realities, defining rights, responsibilities, and penalties in ways that applied across the kingdom. Royal authority extended through officials who represented the king in different regions, ensuring that decisions made at the center were enforced locally. Trade continued to grow, connecting England to wider European networks, bringing wealth that supported both the crown and local economies. And yet, despite all this progress, despite the creation of a unified kingdom, despite the victories and the systems that supported them, England was not beyond danger. Because across the sea, the Scandinavian world had not disappeared. It had changed. It had grown more organized, more ambitious. And by the late 10th century, new leaders would rise who were not content with raids or settlements. They wanted control. The stability that had been built would be tested again. And this time, the challenge would not come in small waves or scattered attacks. It would come as a renewed, determined effort to take the entire kingdom. And as before, everything would depend on how England responded, because history was about to repeat itself, but under very different conditions. By the middle of the 12th century, the idea of a unified England was no longer just an ambition. It was a reality that had been fought for, constructed, and defended through decades of effort, from the survival of Alfred the Great to the expansion under Edward the Elder and the decisive unification achieved by Aethelstan. The island had been transformed from a fractured landscape into a single Rajnitic entity. But unity did not mean permanence, because what had been built through strength could be undone through weakness. And after Ethelstan's death in 939 CE, the kingdom entered a period where stability existed, but it was fragile, dependent on the strength of each ruler who followed, and not all of them were equal to the task. Kings came and went, some capable, some less so. And while the administrative system remained, while the idea of England endured, cracks began to form, not immediately visible, but present beneath the surface. And across the North Sea, those cracks were being watched. The Scandinavian world had not remained static during this time. It had evolved. Kingdoms in Denmark and Norway were becoming more centralized, more organized, and their rulers were no longer just leaders of raiding bands. They were kings with ambitions that extended far beyond seasonal plunder. England, wealthy, organized, and relatively stable, became an increasingly attractive target, not just for raids, but for conquest. The attacks that began in the late 10th century were different from those of earlier generations. They were larger, more coordinated, and more persistent. During the reign of Aethelred the Unready, these pressures intensified dramatically. His nickname, often misunderstood, does not mean he was unprepared in the modern sense, but rather ill-advised, suggesting poor counsel and ineffective decisions. And in many ways, his reign reflects the difficulty of responding to a threat that was constantly evolving. At first, the response followed an increasingly common strategy: payment, the Danegeld. Rather than fighting costly and uncertain battles, the English crown began paying large sums of silver to Viking forces in exchange for peace. And at first glance, this made sense. England was wealthy, its economy strong enough to generate the resources needed. Paying could avoid destruction. It could buy time, but it came with a cost far beyond silver, because it sent a message that England could be exploited. And so the attacks did not stop. They increased. Each payment encouraged another demand. Each truce was temporary, and the cycle continued. Archaeological discoveries, especially large coin hoards buried during this period, reveal the scale of this wealth and its movement. Thousands of silver coins, not just from England, but from across Europe and even the Islamic world, showing how interconnected these economies had become and how the wealth of England flowed outward under pressure. But alongside payment, there were attempts at resistance. Armies were raised, defenses organized, and yet coordination often failed. Because England, though unified, still depended on local leadership, regional forces, and the ability of the king to command loyalty and action across the entire obladi. And when that coordination broke down, the results were devastating. One of the most infamous moments of Ethelred's reign came in 1002 CE, the St. Brice's Day massacre. Fearing internal threats, the king ordered the killing of Danes living in England. This was not a battlefield decision. It was an act of fear and desperation. And its consequences were severe, because among those killed were individuals connected to powerful Scandinavian leaders, including, according to some accounts, relatives of Sweyn Forkbeard. And this turned conflict into something far more personal. Sweyn did not come as a raider seeking wealth. He came as a king seeking vengeance and power. His campaigns against England were relentless. Year after year, pressure increased. Cities were attacked, territories destabilized, and eventually the balance broke. In 1013 CE, Sweyn launched a full-scale invasion. This was not a raid. It was conquest, and it worked. One by one, regions submitted. Resistance collapsed, and Aethelred was forced to flee, leaving England under the control of a Danish king. For the first time since the early Viking Age, the entire kingdom had fallen under Scandinavian rule. But Sweyn's victory was short-lived. In 1014 CE, he died. Suddenly, unexpectedly, and this created a new crisis. Because his son, Nut the Great, was not immediately able to secure the throne, Aethelred returned. England once again shifted, but the conflict was not over. It intensified, because Nut was determined, and he returned with force. The struggle that followed was brutal, a contest not just of armies, but of endurance, strategy, and control. And in 1016 CE, it reached its conclusion. Knut defeated the remaining English resistance and became king. But what makes his rule remarkable is not just that he conquered England. It is how he ruled it. Because Knut did not destroy the existing system. He used it. He adopted Anglo-Saxon administrative structures, worked with local elites, and governed in a way that blended Scandinavian and English traditions. His empire did not stop at England. It extended across the North Sea, Denmark, Norway, parts of Scandinavia united under a single ruler. This was something entirely new, a North Sea empire, and within it, England was not a conquered land in constant rebellion. It was a central component. Knut issued laws that reflected this synthesis, combining elements of Anglo-Saxon legal tradition with Scandinavian practices, creating a system that was both familiar and adapted. Trade flourished. Stability returned. And for a time, it seemed that this new order might last. But like all empires built around a single powerful ruler, it depended on continuity. And when Knut died in 1035 CE, the continuity began to break. His successors struggled to maintain control. Rivalries emerged, divisions deepened, and gradually, the unity of his empire dissolved. In England, this opened the door for a return to Anglo-Saxon rule. In 1042 CE, Edward the Confessor came to the throne. His reign marked a restoration, but not a return to the past. Because England had changed. The influence of Scandinavian rule remained embedded in its culture, its administration, its identity. This was no longer the England of Alfred, or even Athelstan. It was something more complex. A kingdom shaped by centuries of conflict, adaptation, and integration. And yet, even as stability returned, even as the kingdom functioned, even as power seemed secure, there was something unresolved. Because Edward had no clear heir, and in a kingdom where succession mattered above all else, that absence created uncertainty. Uncertainty that others would notice. Across the sea, in Normandy, in Scandinavia, among powerful figures who saw opportunity in instability. And when Edward's reign came to an end, that uncertainty would explode into one of the most famous and decisive moments in English history. A year that would change everything, and with it, the end of one era and the beginning of another. By the time Edward the Confessor approached the end of his life in early 1066, England stood as one of the most organized and wealthy kingdoms in Europe, shaped by centuries of struggle, from the collapse of Roman rule to the rise of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. From Viking invasions to the creation of a unified continent, it had endured wave after wave of crisis and transformation. And yet, at this moment, its greatest threat would not come from slow decline or distant raids, but from a sudden and explosive skirmish over one simple question. Who would be king? Edward had no son, no direct heir, and in a system where legitimacy depended on lineage, support, and recognition, that absence created a vacuum that powerful men were ready to fill. Among them, one figure stood at the center of English politics, a man of immense influence, wealth, and military power. Harold Godwin's son. Harold was not an outsider. He was deeply embedded in the structure of the kingdom, the son of a powerful earl, the leader of armies, a man who had proven his ability in both politics and war. And when Edward died in January 1066, Harold was chosen by the English elite, crowned king in a process that followed established tradition. But outside England, others saw the situation very differently. Across the Channel, in Normandy, another claimant prepared his case. William the Conqueror. William claimed that Edward had promised him the throne. He also claimed that Harold himself had sworn an oath to support that claim. Whether these claims were entirely true or politically constructed is still debated, but what matters is that William believed, or at least asserted, that he had a legitimate right to rule England, and he was willing to fight for it. But he was not the only one. From the north came a third claimant, Harald Hardrada, a seasoned warrior king with experience across Europe and beyond. Hardrada also saw opportunity in England's uncertain succession. He formed an alliance with Tostig, Harold Godwinson's own brother, who had been exiled and now sought revenge. 3 claims, 3 Ilkua, 1 throne, and the stage was set for a year unlike any other. Harold Godwin's son, now king, faced an impossible situation. Threats for both south and north. Two powerful enemies preparing to invade, and the need to defend a kingdom that stretched across the entire island. At first, the danger came from the north. In September 1066, Harold Hardrada and Tostig landed in northern England with a large army. They advanced quickly, defeating local forces at the Battle of Fulford, and for a moment, it seemed that the north might fall. But Harold moved with remarkable speed, marching his army north in a matter of days. He caught the invaders by surprise at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. The result was decisive. Hardrada was killed. Tostig was killed. The Norwegian threat was crushed. It was a victory that should have secured Harold's position, but it came at a cost. His army had marched hard, fought fiercely, and had little time to recover. Because while he was in the north, another invasion had begun. William had crossed the Channel, landing on the southern coast of England. The timing was critical. Perfect. Harold now had to do the unthinkable. March his army south. Immediately. No rest. No recovery. Facing a fresh, prepared force. This was the moment when everything balanced on exhaustion, timing, and nirnay. Harold chose to fight. He could not wait. He could not allow William to consolidate his position, to gather support, to strengthen his foothold. And so he moved south, toward the place where the future of England would be decided. The two armies met near a place now known as Battle of Hastings. October 14th, 1066. The battle that would end one era and begin another. Harold's army took position on a ridge, forming a shield wall, a defensive formation that had proven effective in countless battles, a solid line of warriors, shields locked, holding ground. William's forces were different. A combination of infantry, archers, and cavalry, more flexible, more varied in tactics. The battle began, and it lasted for hours. Repeated assaults by Norman forces were repelled. The shield wall held. At times, it seemed that Harold might win, that the defense would succeed. But battles are not decided by strength alone. They're decided by moments, by shifts, by small changes that cascade into larger outcomes. At some point during the fighting, the English line broke. Whether through pursuit, miscommunication, or tactical deception, parts of the shield wall opened. And once that happened, the advantage shifted. Norman cavalry exploited the gaps. Pressure increased. The line weakened. And then came the Nirnayak moment. Harold was killed. Exactly how remains uncertain. Later accounts famously describe an arrow striking his eye. But whatever the exact cause, his death marked the collapse of organized resistance. Without their king, the English forces began to fall apart. The battle was lost. But the conquest was not yet complete. Because winning a battle is one thing. Taking a kingdom is another. William did not immediately control all of England. He had to advance, secure key locations, deal with resistance. And it took time, but step by step he moved forward. London submitted. Key leaders accepted his rule. And by the end of 1066, William was crowned King of England. The Norman conquest was complete. But what makes this moment so significant is not just that one ruler replaced another. It is what changed because of it. Because this was not simply a continuation of Anglo-Saxon rule under a new king. It was a transformation. The ruling elite changed. Norman nobles replaced Anglo-Saxon leaders. Land was redistributed. Power structures were reshaped. The language of the court shifted toward Norman French. While Old English remained among the people, it began to absorb new influences. The administrative system evolved, becoming more centralized, more controlled. And one of the most remarkable outcomes of this transformation was recorded in a document created 2 decades later. The Domesday Book, a detailed survey of land, wealth, and resources across England. It shows a kingdom that had been reorganized, measured, and brought under a new kind of authority. But even as change swept across the Elbalete, continuity remained. The foundations built over centuries, systems of governance, patterns of settlement, economic structures did not disappear overnight. They adapted, merged with new influences, creating something that was neither fully Anglo-Saxon nor entirely Norman, but something new, medieval England. And when you look back across the entire story, from a moment Honorius told Britain to defend itself, to the fall of Harold at Hastings, you can see a continuous thread. Collapse, adaptation, transformation, again and again. The end of Roman rule did not end Britain. It changed it. The arrival of the Anglo-Saxons did not erase what came before. It reshaped it. The Viking invasions did not destroy the kingdom. They forced it to evolve. And the Norman conquest, often seen as an ending, was also a beginning. Because history does not move in clean breaks. It moves in layers, each era building on the last. And the England that emerged after 1066 carried within it every part of that journey. Roman, British, Anglo-Saxon, Viking, Norman, all combined into a single story. A story that began in uncertainty, passed through chaos, and became something far greater than any one moment. And that is where this story reaches its end. Not as a conclusion, but as a transformation into the next chapter of history. After the victory at Battle of Hastings, it might seem as though the story of England resets, as if everything that came before is suddenly erased and replaced by something entirely new. But that is not how history works, and what followed under William the Conqueror was not a clean break. It was a forceful layering, a restructuring built on top of what already existed, where change was real and often brutal. But continuity never fully disappeared. And to understand how England truly transformed, you have to look closely at what William did after he became king. Because winning the throne was only the beginning of a much longer process of control, consolidation, and reshaping an entire kingdom that had its own deeply rooted systems, traditions, and expectations. William did not inherit a passive land. He inherited a kingdom that had just lost its king in battle, where resistance still existed, where loyalty was uncertain, and where many of the most powerful Anglo-Saxon nobles had either died at Hastings or were unwilling to accept Norman rule. And so his first years as king were not peaceful. They were marked by tension, rebellion, and the constant need to enforce authority in a land that did not yet fully accept him, especially in regions far from his initial base in the south, where control weakened with distance and where local Elqua could still challenge his power. One of the most important things William understood was that control required presence, and presence required force. And so he began constructing castles across England, not just as defensive structures, but as symbols of domination, visible reminders that a new Ishva now ruled. And these were not the types of fortifications that had existed before in Anglo-Saxon England. They were different in both design and purpose. Often built quickly using timber at first, the classic motte and bailey structure with a raised mound, the motte topped by a wooden keep and an enclosed courtyard, the bailey surrounded by palisades, allowing a relatively small Norman force to control a much larger surrounding population. At places like Tower of London, this strategy becomes even more visible because the tower was not just a military structure, it was a statement built in stone designed to dominate the landscape and the people, placed in a key location to control the city of London and to project power in a way that could not be ignored. And across the country, similar constructions appeared, smaller, but no less significant, each one anchoring Norman authority into the Il-Urdu itself, creating a network of a Cypra that made rebellion far more difficult. But castles alone were not enough, because power also depended on who controlled the land, and this is where one of the most dramatic changes took place. The redistribution of land from Anglo-Saxon elites to Norman nobles, a process that was both systematic and ruthless, because William could not risk leaving large amounts of land in the hands of those who might oppose him. And so, over time, the old aristocracy was replaced, not entirely erased, but heavily reduced, as Norman lords took control of estates across England, creating a new ruling class that owed its loyalty directly to the king. This was not just a political change, it was a social transformation, because land was the foundation of wealth, power, and influence, and by controlling who held land, William reshaped the entire structure of society, establishing a system that would later be recognized as feudalism, where land was granted in exchange for service, especially military service, creating a hierarchy that linked king to noble, noble to knight, and knight to land, binding the kingdom together through obligation and control. And yet, even as these changes took place, the underlying systems of administration did not disappear because the Anglo-Saxon state had already developed sophisticated methods of governance, systems of taxation, law, and local administration that were too effective to discard, and William, rather than replacing them entirely, adapted them, using existing structures to maintain control, ensuring continuity even within transformation. This balance between change and continuity is perhaps best captured in the creation of the Domesday Book in 1086, a massive survey of the kingdom that recorded landholdings, resources, populations, and wealth in extraordinary detail, something almost unmatched in medieval Europe. And what this document shows is not just Norman Secra, but the survival of earlier systems. Because in order to record and tax the kingdom effectively, William relied on local knowledge, on existing administrative divisions, on the very structures that had been built over centuries before him. The Domesday Book reveals a kingdom that is both new and old at the same time, where Norman lords hold land, but the patterns of settlement remain rooted in earlier periods, where economic activity continues, shaped by agriculture, trade, and local production, and where the daily lives of ordinary people, farmers, craftsmen, villagers, continue within a framework that, while altered, is still connected to the past. Language itself became a reflection of this layered transformation, because while the ruling elite spoke Norman French and Latin remained the language of the church and administration, Old English did not vanish. It persisted among the population, evolving, absorbing new words, adapting to new realities, and over time, this blending would give rise to Middle English, a language that carried within it the history of conquest, contact, and change. And the church, which had played such a central role in earlier Anglo-Saxon society, also underwent transformation. Norman bishops replaced many of their Anglo-Saxon counterparts. Church structures were reorganized, and new architectural styles emerged. Stone cathedrals replacing older buildings, reflecting both religious and political change. Because the church was not separate from it, it was deeply connected to it. And controlling the church meant influencing belief, culture, and legitimacy. But even with all these changes, resistance did not disappear immediately, because in the north of England, far from the centers of Norman power, rebellion continued, leading to one of the harshest actions of William's reign, the harrying of the North, a campaign designed to crush opposition through devastation, destroying crops, settlements, and resources, leaving regions weakened for years. And this event shows the darker side of conquest, the cost of a secra when faced with persistent resistance, and the lengths to which William was willing to go to secure his rule. Over time, however, opposition diminished, not because memory faded, but because new generations grew up within this new country, for whom Norman rule was not an invasion, but a reality, and as decades passed, the distinctions between Anglo-Saxon and Norman began to blur. Intermarriage, shared governance, and common experience gradually creating a more unified identity, though one still shaped by its complex past. And when you step back and look at the entire arc of this story, from the moment Honorius told Britain to defend itself, to the rise of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the coming of Christianity, the Viking invasions, the creation of unified England, and finally the Norman conquest, what you see is not a series of disconnected events, but a continuous process of adaptation, where each crisis forced change. Each change created new possibilities, and each new possibility reshaped the future. The end of Roman Britain did not destroy society. It transformed it into something new. The Anglo-Saxon period did not remain static. It evolved through conflict and integration. The Viking Age did not erase what came before, it merged with it. And the Norman conquest, often seen as was in many ways another beginning, building on everything that had come before while pushing England into a new phase of its history. Because history is never still. It moves, it shifts, it builds layer upon layer, and the England that emerged after 1066 carried within it the memory of Rome, the strength of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the influence of Viking settlers, and the structure of Norman rule, all combined into a single, evolving identity. And yet the story does not stop with William the Conqueror, because what he created was not just a new ruling class, but a new direction, a shift that pulled England into a much wider world, one that stretched across the Channel, deep into continental Europe, and into the diapolitics of kingdoms that were no longer isolated, but deeply connected through blood, power, and ambition. And as the years passed after 1066, something subtle but powerful began to happen. England stopped being a distant island shaped mainly by its own internal struggles, and became part of a much larger network of influence, conflict, and opportunity. William himself was not only King of England, he was also Duke of Normandy, and this dual identity created a situation that would define English history for centuries, because the King of England was now also a vassal to the King of France for his continental lands, a relationship that seems contradictory, a king who is also subordinate to another king. But in the medieval world, power did not follow simple lines. It followed land, loyalty, and obligation, and this meant that England's rulers were now deeply entangled in French politics, in disputes over territory, alliances, and control that would shape the future in ways no one in 1066 could fully predict. After William's death in 1087, his lands did not pass cleanly to a single heir in a simple way. Instead, they were divided. His son William II, known as William Rufus, took the English throne, while Normandy went to another son, Robert Curthose, and this division created immediate tension, because controlling England and Normandy separately weakened the unity William had built and opened the door to rivalry, conflict, and shifting alliances, not just between brothers, but among the nobles who served them. William Rufus ruled England with strength, but also with controversy. His reign marked by conflicts with the church and with nobles, but also by the continuation of strong royal authority, and yet his sudden death in 1100, under mysterious circumstances while hunting in the New Forest, once again threw the kingdom into uncertainty. And it was another brother, Henry I, who seized the opportunity, moving quickly to claim the throne and secure his position. Henry I's reign represents something important, a continuation of Norman rule, but also a refinement of governance, because he understood that power was not just about conquest, it was about control, administration, and stability, and under his rule, the machinery of government became more organized, more efficient, building on both Anglo-Saxon and Norman traditions, creating a system that could manage a kingdom that was growing more complex with each generation. One of his most significant actions was the reunification of England and Normandy, achieved after defeating his brother Robert at the Battle of Canterbury in 1106, bringing back together the lands that had been divided after William's death, and restoring a sense of unity to the Anglo-Norman realm. But this unity came with a cost, because it deepened England's involvement in continental affairs, tying its future even more closely to the politics of France. Henry's reign also highlights another critical aspect of medieval rule, succession, and the dangers that came when it was uncertain, because despite his strength as a king, his plans for the future were shattered in 1120 with the disaster of the White Ship, that changed everything, when his only legitimate son, William Adelin, drowned along with many of the young nobles of England, leaving Henry without a clear male heir. This single event created a crisis that would not fully unfold until after Henry's death, but its consequences were already clear, because without a stable line of succession, the kingdom faced the risk of division, conflict, and civil war, something that had been seen before and would now return again in a new form. Henry named his daughter, Empress Matilda, as his heir, an unusual decision in a world where female rule was rare and often contested, and although many nobles swore to support her, loyalty in medieval politics was often fragile, dependent on circumstances, opportunity, and Elcoa, and when Henry died in 1135, those tensions erupted. Instead of Matilda taking the throne, her cousin Stephen of Blois moved quickly, seizing the crown with the support of keen nobles, and what followed was not a smooth transition, but a period of chaos known as the Anarchy, a civil war that tore across England for nearly 2 decades, where authority broke down, castles were built and held by rival factions, and the kingdom fragmented under competing claims. This period is crucial because it shows how fragile the system could be when central authority weakened, how quickly order could collapse into disorder, and how the structures built over generations could be strained to the breaking point. And yet, even in this chaos, the foundations of governance did not completely disappear. They endured imperfectly, unevenly, but still present. Eventually, the conflict came to an end not through total victory, but through compromise, with an agreement that Stephen would remain king, but Matilda's son would succeed him, and that son would become one of the most important rulers in medieval Europe. Henry II. With his accession in 1154, a new phase begins, one that takes the story far beyond the island itself, because Henry II did not just rule England. He controlled vast territories across France, from Normandy to Aquitaine, creating what historians often call the Angevin Empire, a realm that stretched across much of Western Europe, far larger and more powerful than anything England had been before. And this is where the story truly expands, because now England is no longer just reacting to invasions or internal sangers. It is part of a continental power, deeply involved in European politics, in conflicts with the French crown, in disputes over land, authority, and influence that would shape centuries of history. Henry II's reign also marks major developments in law and governance, because he worked to strengthen royal authority, reform legal systems, and extend the reach of justice across his lands, building on earlier traditions but pushing them further, creating systems that would have lasting influence, including the development of common law, a legal framework that would shape not only England, but many parts of the world in the centuries to come. And yet, even as power expanded, new tensions emerged, conflicts between king and church, most famously with Thomas Becket, whose murder in 1170 shocked the kingdom and highlighted the limits of royal authority when it came into conflict with religious power, showing once again that even the strongest kings could not control everything. And beyond internal conflict, external challenges remained, because the relationship between English kings and French rulers was never simple, always shifting between cooperation and rivalry, a tension that would eventually lead to even larger conflicts in the centuries ahead. So what began with the fall of Roman Britain has now transformed into something far larger, a kingdom that has survived collapse, invasion, conquest, and civil war, and has emerged not isolated, but deeply connected to the wider world, shaping and being shaped by forces far beyond its shores. And from here, the story does not slow down. It grows. The centuries that followed the consolidation of Anglo-Saxon power under Alfred and his successors saw England emerge from the shadows of Viking invasions into a kingdom increasingly aware of its own identity, shaped by the interplay of conquest, settlement, faith, and law. The efforts of Alfred the Great to stabilize his realm, create organized defenses through the network of Buzz, and codify a coherent legal system, combined with the vision of his successors, laid the foundations for a kingdom that would endure both internal upheaval and external threat. As Edward the Elder and his sister Ethelflaed continued the campaigns to recover territories lost to Scandinavian settlers, they not only restored territorial control, but began to weave the disparate Anglo-Saxon realms into a unified political fabric. The treaties and alliances formed during this period were more than mere military maneuvers. They signaled the emergence of a consciousness that this land, with its complex patchwork of peoples, customs, and beliefs, was becoming a single entity, bound not merely by conquest, but by shared institutions and evolving cultural norms. With the consolidation of England under Athelstan in 927, the island witnessed its first ruler to command authority across all the Anglo-Saxon territories, and yet this unification was fragile, dependent on military might, strategic marriages, and careful diplomacy, with neighboring kingdoms and Scandinavian powers. Ethelstan's reign also marked a cultural and administrative transformation. Centers like York, which had previously oscillated between Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian control, now became hubs for governance, trade, and law, illustrating how conquest and cultural exchange could yield new centers of influence. The coinage, legal reforms, and administrative records from this period demonstrate the sophisticated integration of diverse traditions, blending Anglo-Saxon governance with Scandinavian pragmatism, creating a system that could endure the pressures of both internal dissent and external incursion. The death of Athelstan set a precedent for the precarious balance of succession in England, where dynastic claims, often intertwined with regional loyalties and foreign alliances, could provoke decades of instability. This tension was exemplified during the reigns of his successors, particularly Edmund and Eadred, who faced persistent Viking incursions, requiring both military acumen and political ingenuity to maintain the integrity of the kingdom. Each conflict, treaty, and fortification from this era added to a complex mosaic of English governance, in which regional autonomy coexisted with the overarching authority of the crown. The interplay of secular and ecclesiastical power became increasingly significant, as bishops and abbots held not only spiritual influence, but substantial temporal authority, often acting as intermediaries in disputes and custodians of land and wealth critical to sustaining military campaigns. The turn of the millennium brought new challenges. The resurgence of Viking ambition under leaders such as Sweyn Forkbeard and later Knut the Great tested the resilience of the Anglo-Saxon polity. Knut's eventual conquest of England in 1016 did not destroy the existing structures, but rather adapted them, demonstrating a pragmatic approach to governance. He maintained the Anglo-Saxon administrative machinery, incorporated English laws with Scandinavian customs, and used marriage alliances and local lords to secure loyalty. Archaeological evidence from sites like Winchester and London shows continuity in urban planning, craft production, and ecclesiastical patronage, indicating that while rulers changed, the underlying society evolved without total disruption. Knut's reign exemplifies the capacity for synthesis that had characterized England for centuries. Germanic, Anglo-Saxon, and Scandinavian elements merged to form a cohesive political and cultural entity. With the restoration of native rule under Edward the Confessor in 1042, England entered a period of relative internal stability that allowed the cultivation of a distinctly English identity. Edward's reign, however, was not without tension. The succession crisis that followed his death would set the stage for one of the most transformative episodes in English history, the Norman conquest. Yet even before the arrival of William the Conqueror, the kingdom's social, political, and cultural foundations had been shaped by centuries of interaction between Roman legacies, Germanic settlement, Scandinavian influence, and Christian institutions. Anglo-Saxon kingship had evolved from localized warlord rule into a sophisticated monarchy, underpinned by codified law, ecclesiastical partnerships, and administrative structures capable of integrating diverse regions and peoples. The Norman conquest of 1066, culminating in the decisive Battle of Hastings, marked both an end and a beginning. The displacement of the Anglo-Saxon elite and the introduction of Norman lords brought profound changes, but these did not entirely erase the continuity established over the previous centuries. Instead, England's legal, ecclesiastical, and cultural frameworks were augmented and reorganized under a new ruling class. Domesday Book, commissioned by William in 1086, illustrates the level of administrative sophistication achieved and provides a striking window into a society built upon layers of inherited structures: Anglo-Saxon organization, Scandinavian settlements, and Romanized administrative techniques, now consolidated under Norman authority. Norman castles, cathedrals, and urban developments physically reshaped the landscape, yet the patterns of settlement, trade, and local governance retained echoes of their Anglo-Saxon and even earlier Roman origins. During this period, England's identity continued to crystallize through synthesis. The blending of Anglo-Saxon law and governance with Norman feudal structures, the continuation of Christian traditions while accommodating new ecclesiastical hierarchies, and the persistence of local cultural practices alongside continental influences. The legacy of Alfred's buzz, Ethelstan's unification, Knut's pragmatic rulership, and Edward the Confessor's consolidation of authority all contributed to a kingdom capable of absorbing conquest and still maintaining a distinct identity. In parallel, the English language itself began its transformation, enriched by Old Norse and Norman French vocabulary, creating the linguistic foundation for the Middle English that would flourish in the following centuries. Literature, law, and administrative practice reflected this hybridized culture, a living testament to centuries of conquest, adaptation, and cultural blending. By the end of the 11th century, England stood as a kingdom deeply aware of its history, a land shaped by invasions, settlement, and resilience. From the withdrawal of Roman authority in 410, through the struggles of Romano-British warlords, the arrival of Germanic settlers, the Christianization of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and the repeated waves of Viking incursion, the trajectory of English history reveals a remarkable capacity for adaptation and integration. Each successive wave of invaders contributed not only to destruction, but also to renewal. The material culture, legal systems, and social organization that emerged were never static, but the product of constant negotiation between old and new, native and foreign, sacred and secular. This historical continuity and adaptation set the stage for England's medieval development, where the interactions between crown, nobility, church, and populace would continue to define the kingdom's character. The Norman arrival, rather than creating a wholly foreign entity, was absorbed into a lineage of historical experiences that had already made England a land of synthesis, where survival and prosperity depended on blending traditions, learning from past upheavals, and crafting new structures capable of enduring both internal strife and external pressures. By understanding the layers of England's transformation, from Roman province to Anglo-Saxon kingdom, through Viking incursions and Scandinavian governance, to Norman rule, we can trace a continuous thread of cultural resilience and institutional evolution. These centuries were not merely periods of conquest and collapse, but a dynamic process of adaptation, integration, and identity formation, producing a kingdom capable of enduring and thriving despite the turbulence of early medieval Europe. England's story, in its final stretch through the early Norman era, thus becomes a testament to the enduring legacy of centuries of change. It demonstrates how political structures, legal frameworks, religious institutions, and material culture, each shaped by conquest, settlement, and strategic governance, collectively forged a cohesive society. The resilience, adaptability, and synthesis that characterized England from the post-Roman period through the Norman consolidation became hallmarks of its historical identity, creating a foundation upon which medieval England would build its political, cultural, and social achievements. It is a narrative not of isolated events, but of continuous transformation, a story in which each conquest, each migration, each legal innovation, and each cultural exchange contributed to the England that would endure and eventually emerge as a significant power in the medieval world. The centuries-long process of integration, adaptation, and survival, culminating in the Norman period, provides a continuous historical thread that links Britain's ancient past to its medieval future. The lessons of resilience, the synthesis of diverse cultural influences, and the creation of governance structures capable of absorbing and organizing complexity ensure that England could navigate the challenges of conquest, internal division, and external threats. From Roman withdrawal to the consolidation under William the Conqueror, England's history is a story of continuity through change, of institutions and identities forged in the crucible of centuries of upheaval, and of a society that would continue to evolve, carrying forward the legacies of its layered past into the shaping of a medieval kingdom ready to face the evolving dynamics of European politics, culture, and power.